Thank you all. God, it's wonderful that everybody is here. It's these kind of events, these symposia, take a long time to plan, and they're always in this imaginary world that, you know, someday we're all going to get together and we're going to have this symposium. And then all of a sudden, everybody's here. And so I'm delighted that everybody is finally here. And as you know, that my old friend and colleague Nadir Ardalan and I'm Tom Barry, co-chaired the planning of this symposium. And so both of us will do some words of welcome. This is going to be very brief. We want to get right to the paper sessions. So I'm going to just speak very briefly about a little bit about ACS, about the International Forum for Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality. For those of you that maybe this is your first meeting and you are not overly familiar with the group, for those of us who have been involved in this for quite some years, of course, you won't be learning anything from what I've got to say. But just very briefly, and then Nadir's going to get up and speak about the spirit of this symposia. And then Nadir, after you speak, then I got a couple of house cleaning things. We'll leave that to the very end.
He's going to catch all my mistakes.
Yes, that's right. That's right. ACS, as we've grown to call it, was founded about 7 years ago, and it came out of a conversation of some friends at a conference who had been doing research on sacred architecture and other related aspects of considerations of the built environment that realized that they would really benefit from a broadening community that we thought was there of like-minded, you might say, individuals or academics who considered those topical areas to be their primary subject areas, practicing architects who tend to focus on, say, the design of sacred space or churches and so forth. And from that point on, we started contacting people. And since then, for those of you who don't know, we have had, this is our 5th symposium. We have had 5, when this will be done, we have had a symposium every year since the founding of the group. Now, we have a kind of a guiding group that we somehow ended up calling the Executive Committee, which I know sounds a little bit Eastern Bloc, but and it's myself, it's Julio Bermudez, it's Nadir Ardalan, it's Anat Giva, and it's Rebecca Krinke, and it's Philip Tabb. But Philip is also doubling as a taxi driver, and so he's getting a friend of mine at the train station right now. And we just formed this group as a way to do some of the pre-planning and so forth, but we've grown to depend on many people in the planning and execution. I just introduced you, Philip Tabb. Thanks, Phil. Thanks for.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, you may.
I went to the train station. I think I went to the wrong one.
There's only one.
Well, there was nobody there.
Oh, well,
Shall we just wait?
just wait. He'll call me, probably right in the middle of my talk here. Okay, so, and this group is always, I think, you know, for me, the group has been about, a collection of individuals that just sought ways to perhaps make the built environment, and by extension perhaps the world, maybe just a little bit better through the incorporation of considerations of the sacred, of spiritual practices, of what I call a kind of broader context of architecture. And certainly for me, it's worked that way. I'm incredibly grateful for this group, for my dear colleagues, because it's really helped my research and by extension my teaching. From a small group, we've grown to a membership of 280. We have members from all over the world, and this symposium is also a measure of how it's really truly has become an international group. We have people who have come here from all over the world, from Holland, from Morocco, from China, from Russia, Sorry?
Australia.
From Australia, yes. India, Switzerland, Canada, Texas. And so we have 280 members at this point, and the five symposia. The first one was at Mount Angel. This is the third one we're doing at a Benedictine monastery. The first one was Mount Angel in Salem, Oregon, with the beautiful Alto Library. The second one was at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota. The third was at Serenbe, a sustainable community outside of Atlanta, actually designed by Phil Tabb. The fourth was in Mexico, near, what was the name of it?
Chichen Itza.
Chichen Itza area, yeah. Near Cancun, but not too near to Cancun. And then of course, this one this year. And we've had publications that have come out of that, and we have a kind of an active program now of dissemination and publication of some of the findings from our symposia. So, and then I just want to say that this symposia depended not only on, of course, the co-chairs, but on the executive committee, and it also depended on a whole group of folks who did review of papers, and many of them are here. We had over 30 people who reviewed 111 submissions, and they included Julio and Anat and Phil Tabb and Rebecca, Roberto Ciotti, who's on his way, he'll be here tomorrow, Dennis Winters, Michael Crosby, Lindsay Jones, Heijung Chang, going down the list, I don't want to miss anybody here, Maged Senbel, Allison Snyder, who will be here tomorrow, Steve Paget, who's on his way, and Paul Tazar. So thank you, all of you. I thought that the paper review session went very, very well. And we had an acceptance rate of about 20%, so congratulations to everybody who had papers accepted. So Nadir is now going to talk about a little bit more about the spirit and background of this particular symposium before we end up turning it over to the first paper sessions. And Doug is, yeah.
These feel like the body searches that we've all gone through coming here on these different airplanes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ongoing series of explorations and dialogues and conversations, because that's really all that they are. We've tried more than anything else to keep our sessions in a search mode, because somehow the group, as it has coalesced, has felt that what we've inherited in terms of our urban built environment is really something that is less than to be desired. And there are so many signs that some alternative means and ways of looking and acting are necessary in order to preserve really the human species on this planet Earth. I'm always reminded by Lucan admonition about what great architecture should be, and paraphrasing him, he said that great architecture begins with the unmeasurable, a vision of the unmeasurable, realized through the measurable, through design and construction, but ultimate test is if it, again, seeks and reaches the unmeasurable once you have perceived and walked through it. So I don't know how much of the buildings and of the cities that we are working and living in reach that element of the unmeasurable, the uplifting in us anymore. Certainly they are there. Since we're about 7 billion people now, moving to 9 billion in the next 30 to 50 years, and more or less 50% of us live in urban centers, and we will be probably 80% urbanized by that time. We'll probably be building as many new cities and environments as has ever existed in human history. So really, I mean, to be honest with you, that's just one generation away when we'll be having to deal with this. And if by this time we're not adequately preparing our architects, our citizens, our municipalities for an alternative approach and attitude to where we would live and play and live out our lives, then I think it'll be too late. So with this as a drive, we began about 2 years ago, given the task by our ACS group to do something with regards to urbanism and spirituality. We said, why don't we try to partner with Harvard University to find where they are in this subject, and perhaps we ourselves always wanting to seek to expand our own capability and visions. We were very happy to find this wonderful gentleman who will speak with us tonight, and I don't think he is yet here in this session, and that's Professor Harvey Cox. And so I went to Harvey, whom I did not know, but I was introduced to him by Antonio, and Antonio was introduced to me by another young man at Harvard with whom we had researched the anthropology of the Middle East, and particularly the Persian Gulf. So I came to speak to Harvey about this quest. How can we deal with the idea of spirituality in our urban setting? And as you know, Harvey had written 30-some years ago, actually probably maybe more, maybe 40 years ago, almost 50 years ago, to be honest with you, that wonderful book called The Secular City. And ever since then, he's been dealing with this idea, how can you find spirituality in this material world? With Harvey's help, we got the two parts of it going, urbanism and architecture, and spirituality. And then we felt that there was a piece of science that could enhance this work. And we've been researching recently at Harvard with the School of Public Health, and there's a wonderful gentleman who you'll meet tomorrow, Professor Jack Spengler from the School of Public Health. And Jack was very interested, and so he said that the only way I'll get involved is if you add to the name well-being, and of course that fit right in, and we liked it very much. So it became urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. These people really have been the base. Since Harvey is an emeritus at the Divinity School, Professor Ahmad Ragab, who had a new chair, young man, new chair on religion and science. So he was very interested. And so that really began to form this group. And Tom and I, and really the rest of the ACS group, have been helping to mature this work. Our hope has been that we would address, as you have seen in the structure of the symposia, a look at where have we been? What are some of the precedents to places of well-being and of transcendence in the urban context? What has been their characteristic? And I hope that those of you who will be presenting related to that topic will educate and expand our knowledge about that, because truly, with having such a wonderful group from around the world, you're going to be hearing examples of how in each of these great ancient societies there have been these magical cosmogonic cities. I think that the aspect would be it's quite easy to take our present and to denigrate it and to look down on it, but yet it is a magnificent feat that 7 billion people are living on this earth and at some points experiencing unbelievable levels of beauty and at the same time wasting away some of this beauty and creating some of the greatest poverty and ugliness that exists. But we really don't know its full measure. And so I hope those who address will keep these two aspects, because as Erik Erikson, the noted psychologist, has said to us, really you have the two extremes of everything. You have the dark and the light, you have the good and the bad, you have the transcendent and the less transcendent. So how can we keep these two in perspective? Because our world, as we believe, if we go back to Lucan, made of the measurable and the unmeasurable. So let's keep the balance of these two. Let's see where we find the light and speak about it today. Now, obviously, all this should be in preparation for strategies and thoughts about the future, because we're not obviously stargazers or tea leaf readers, so we don't know what the future would be, but there must be trends. There must be positive trends, and maybe also negative trends to guard against. So the idea of past, present, future. So in conclusion, what we really hope to do at the session ends on, really for us, it ends on Sunday when we will reconvene, and for those of you who could stay until Sunday noon, we want to find what did we learn from this symposia, and what are some of the next steps, what are the future sort of visions that we've heard. And one idea came, as all interesting ideas develop. We had to black out this back wall because otherwise there would be too much light, you couldn't see the presentation. But when we were putting up this great big black piece of paper, and we were drawing lines with colored pencil to see the line where we're cutting, we said to ourselves, wouldn't it be wonderful if wonderful artists like that, Philip, and all of us as artists, would write on this black board in time, what did we learn about the past, the present, the future, and it would be like a spontaneous, who was that mad movie Alex Guinness did where they painted on the wall? So I love for you to think, but don't do it yet, that this black belongs to all of you as a great creation. So that's how I like to end. And thank you so much all for coming. You're most welcome. We're really energized by your presence and look forward to a wonderful symposia together. And please, by the way, forgive all the, how can I say, the housekeeping things that may not work right. And we thanked everyone who helps to clean up things. We're still figuring out how to feed everybody on Saturday, things like that. And the vans that take you here and all those things that Tom has been really working on very hard. Be flexible, because this really is a shoestring activity. We've done it through, as you know, you've come here by yourself. This is your offering of your own self for your own self-growth, and then communally for a group. So it's really a pilgrimage toward self-understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just use this.
Thank you, Nadir. We've worked very hard together. Talk about amateurs, right? I can't even hold a microphone here, so thank you, Nadir. Is that how we'll put? Yeah, there we go. Okay, I'm going to be very quick because I'd like to get our paper session started a little bit early, because we need to end a little bit early as well, because a little change in the schedule. Just take note of this. Our reception will be over at Stonecrest, and will be at 5:45, not 6, at 5:45. Dinner will follow, And Professor Harvey Cox's lecture, we begin at 7:15 here. It's just a change because of the way the Abbey actually advertised, because we're expecting a larger crowd from the community as well. If you all don't have one of these, please grab one of those. So our 2 o'clock session, if you could just end a little bit early. We built breaks into it, so you should end early enough so there could be a 10 or a 15-minute breather, and then so that we'd come back a little bit before 4, maybe at 3:50, so then that group can end a little bit early. So that's that piece of housekeeping there. Sunday transportation, some of us have cars, some of us will be driving to Logan on Sunday, so the form is in there. Just let us know when your flight is, and so maybe we can save some folks from having to take public transportation on that day. And also, there's flyers for the Saturday sessions at Harvard. You know, we'll be vanning in to go to that event. Okay, well, I think we can now officially say that this symposium is begun. So I will now turn the podium over.
Well, thank you. I guess I'm the first one here to introduce the speakers in the afternoon. I think everybody's applauding. Let's give a hand to Tom and Nadir, this fantastic work. So I'll just get to the program. So today, both sessions are going to be open sessions. Tomorrow will be urbanism about the past, the present, and the futures. But today, the chair decided to have a more maybe flexible set of conversations, as Nadir puts it. So they will be dealing with the matter of spirituality, well-being, and urbanism in a kind of wider context. So the first session, which is the one I'm moderating, will have 3 papers, and we'll start with the first one here. I'll introduce the speaker, they'll speak, maybe some short clarification question, but I want to have the majority of the time at the end. And I have advised every speaker to stay 20 minutes. So let me introduce Anat Giva. She's there. And she's a registered architect in Israel, an AIA associate member. She's a professor of architecture at Texas A&M University. She teaches design studios, sacred architecture, and historical preservation. Currently, she's the president of the Southeast Society of Architectural Historians and a member of the ACS Executive Committee. Her book, Frank Lloyd Wright, Sacred Architecture, Faith, Form, and Building Technology, was published last year, and I think some flyers. And you can talk to her, really wonderful book. She's the recipient of several awards and research grants, including a recent prestigious grant from Texas A&M University Scholarly and Enhanced Program, supporting a new line of research on sacred architecture of minorities as an expression of American freedom of religion. She wrote this paper with Jody Rosenblatt Naderi. She's a professor at Ball State, and I'm not sure if I should, do you want to introduce her as well? She's a registered practicing landscape architect since 1980. She currently holds the title of Distinguished Professor at Ball State University, where she chairs the Department of Landscape Architecture. Jody received her BA in Fine Arts and Architecture from the University of Maryland and her Master in Landscape Architecture from Harvard University. She has practiced in both private and public sectors, working in the Florida Keys, Baltimore, Toronto, Tehran, and Madrid. Her research and practice in green infrastructure, health, and transportation have received numerous awards and been published in engineering, landscape, and urban planning literature. The paper that they're going to present today is entitled Erub, a transformation of an urban public space to a private place for a spiritual renewal.
I don't have it. I have to hold it. Thank you. Thank you, Julio. And thank you, Tom and Nader, for this wonderful opportunity to present my paper. I just want to say that Jody is sending you greetings from China. She is now representing her school to negotiate some collaboration with 2 schools of landscape architecture in China. So, the Eruv, a transformation of an urban public space to a private place for spiritual renewal, is part of an open session because it deals with past, present, and future. This is a phenomena that was started. You don't hear it? Sorry. You didn't hear it before? You did? No?
Now better.
Okay, now better. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Is it better?
Is it better now?
Yes.
Good. Sorry. So greetings from China, from Jody. That's what I was saying. Okay. So the Eruv is a 3,000 years phenomena, and is still practicing, and it will practice in the future. The 4th commandment, as appeared in Exodus, says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." It is so important that it appears as the 4th before the commandments of do not kill, do not steal, etc. Every Sabbath, starting on Friday night with the lighting of the Sabbath candles, the community begins a weekly ritual of keeping the day holy. It goes on for 24 hours, sunset to sunset. The importance of this day called for interpretation already in Exodus as saying everyone is to stay where he is on the 7th day. No one is to go out. And in Jeremiah, do not bring a load out of your houses or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy. That made the home a sacred place, which is a known concept across location and cultures. However, this interpretation limited the access to experience the holy of the Sabbath in public within a community, confining people to the house and courtyards. With the establishment of the Eruv already 3,000 years ago, every Sabbath an urban area is enclosed by an invisible footprint of a boundary to extend the private domain of Jewish household into public areas, creating spiritual renewals. Thus, the extension of the limits of home helps people to observe the Sabbath in public spaces. The objective of this paper are to describe the Eruv phenomenon and analyze its design principles along accepted aspects of time and space, domestication of urban public space, physical attributes that contribute to the image and legibility of the Eruv in the city, and its capacity to create spiritual renewal. So what is an Eruv? It is literally and metaphorically domestication of an urban space, streets and neighborhoods, providing freedom with a bound. The planning of the Eruv starts in the center, which is the area landmark, usually the synagogue, and it's defined concentrically, attempting to include as many Jewish households of the neighborhood as possible. It is interesting to note that Kevin Lynch's theory on the creation and perception of urban districts identified the landmark as a central point of reference. And Phil Tubbs' matrix that creation of a sacred place also start with a central point, right? The Oxford's dictionaries define Eruv, mixture in Hebrew, as, and I quote, an urban area enclosed by a wire boundary that symbolically extend the private domain of Jewish household into public areas, permitting activities within it that are normally forbidden in public on Sabbath. The Eruv as a concept of mixing refers to many acts of mix, of the forbidden with the permissible. But all agree that the Eruv, and I quote, brings together entities otherwise kept apart on the Sabbath, end of quote. The Talmud, the Jewish law book established 3,000 years ago, introduced the Eruv, or Eruvim in plural, in a 105 two-sided pages volume as part of the books on the Sabbath. The Eruv laws turned the Sabbath into, and I quote, a more modern space, a place both enclosed and open. Over time, the rabbinic definition of an Eruv continue to evolve, especially with the challenges of Jewish community living in larger cities as a minority group. The challenge is highlighted when communities attempt to base their eruv on biblical laws and precedents, with a larger urban area controlled by local government authorities that were not necessarily sympathetic to the concept of the eruv. Often, these conditions raised legal questions, which contributed to heated dispute among the leading rabbis of the time. The eruv must be legal according to the Talmudic law, as well as be legalized by the local government, as it is a temporary use of public property. The eruv committee representatives sign a rental agreement with the government agency representative. For example, in Boston, the Greater Boston Eruv Agreement was signed with the governor of the state of Massachusetts for an 800 years lease. The legal document allows the community to use the utility infrastructure, roads, and public landscape as the eruv's boundaries, and to maintain the eruv even when the city does not offer the found infrastructure along the proposed perimeter. It also allows checking the edge every Thursday to assure the eruv is intact as a completely defined district. Here, they head out by air to get a look at the hillside along the 405. Rooted in the sacred experience, the importance of time in considering the place for accessing the Sabbath is in its meaning, to celebrate time rather than space. For the Orthodox Jew, the temporal dimension of life is what distinguishes place from space and is exemplified by the human experience inside the eruv. The eruv's weekly temporal scale of 1 to 7 expresses a rhythmic anticipation or aftermath of accessing the sacred experience. However, when describing the image of eruv, we detect not only the temporal and spiritual characteristic of the eruv, but also its physical attributes, which create a place. As we look at Doaxitis and Salingaro's definition of place as time plus space, we can determine that the eruv is a place, which allows the access to the spiritual experience of the holy day. Let's imagine a place where once a week, stepping out of the home, you are still, wait a minute, did it go? You are still at home, giving an uplifting spatial experience affected by implementation of the eruv. Thus, the archetype of home becomes materially and spiritually referenced in the establishment of the district of the eruv. If we examine the exterior wall of the home and the post and lintel configuration of the doorway, we can conclude that the doorway determines the edge between public and private, and its threshold distinguishes the spaces. The extension of this edge to include a whole neighborhood during the Sabbath ensures that the connection reflects the precise tectonic of a doorway architecture, such as the wires of horizontal elements of the eruv are attached to the side rather than the top of the pole. By the Talmudic law, the eruv that is made of natural edges is blessed and is considered of a higher quality than eruvim requiring intervention to generate the district edge. And they represent a more permanent relation with nature. More so, the edge is also perceived as a spiritual boundary, creating a transformation of secular space to sacred domain. Therefore, the intent of constructing the eruv can result theoretically in creating an edge as a spiritual metaphor. In fact, an invisible edge, indistinguishable, is better than a profoundly visible edge that is in contrast with its setting. Its threshold defines the most minimalistic expression of transference from private to public domain, since they make the moment of entry. This principle illustrates how the eruv designers alter the physical world with the threshold archetype to achieve access for spiritual renewal. Kevin Lynch defined district as areas characterized by common characteristics, though they may consist of endless variety of their physical commonalities. This is also the case of the Eruv, which in all cities, its symbolic boundaries create a temporal district for 1 day per week. The Eruv example of Elkin Park in Pennsylvania demonstrates how the Eruv, which started with the Orthodox synagogue in red in the map, also encompasses other synagogues from the conservative and reform, such as the famous Bet Shalom synagogue designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1954, indicated on the Eruv map in turquoise. It is interesting to notice that Wright designed the synagogue as a beacon of light for a whole community, making it a central landmark. If it would be an Orthodox synagogue, this landmark would become central to the Eruv and its light serving it as its spiritual inspiration. This slide shows examples of the different configuration of Eruvim or Eruv districts. These images are from a collection of Jody's students when she was still teaching at Texas A&M University. That's when we started this whole line of research. Still, all are based on the specific dimensions of the Eruv district, which were determined by the Talmud according to size, type, and use. Private domain, or Reshut HaYachid, habitable covering at least 12 square feet, demarcated from its surrounding by walls or topography. Public domain, Reshut HaRabim, major roads, plazas not enclosed by walls or roofs and frequented by many people. Semi-public domain, Carmelis, like a shared courtyard, local street, tot lot, can have walls and limited visitors or users who see each other daily. An exempt area, Makom Patur, are cemeteries and bodies of water. The extent of the district surrounding the place should not be more than a 2,000 cubic walk unit, just a little under a kilometer or a half mile. It is very appealing to consider these as universal dimensions. Kevin Lynch considered the path especially important since they reflect the physical organization of the district and urban mobility. The nodes, on the other hand, serve as junctions of path or the path focal point that can also express a point of perception. Uniquely, all places within an Eruv have equal potential both as an origin and as a destination. And the multiple paths connecting these nodes are as diverse and dense as the city's formal and informal pedestrian network. The same network is used during the week for walking, jogging, strolling, or driving. These paths become functional in nature, helping to perform a task, cross boundaries, edges, and threshold. While during the Sabbath, these pathways, as part of the Eruv, help access the spiritual realms of the holy day in that district. To illustrate environmental images as an expression of experiential feature of the Eruv, we turn again to Kevin Lynch and his followers, who used mental cognitive mapping of environmental images as a tool to understand processes of present urbanization, society complexities, and technologies such as digital navigation tools, and to identify components of identity, structure, and meaning. In 2010, Jennifer Kazinow used the idea of mental mapping of the environmental image of the Eruv as a means to understand the perception and process of the Eruv. In this slide, you can trace some of these maps drawn by women from the Jewish community who use the Northwest London Eruv every Sabbath. Although the physical and symbolic edges of the Eruv took many years of planning, they were, and I'm quoting, almost never mentioned as part of the way in which the Eruv practitioners experienced the space, end of quote. It was more about seeing people use the Eruv than to a perceived need to see the boundary. This idea enhances the perception of the Eruv as a vibrant, dynamic time and space for social interaction and pedestrian walking. It should be emphasized that Kazinow focused only on women's responses to mapping the Eruv environmental image. This was performed to support her hypothesis that Jewish women, especially young mothers with babies and small kids, were spatially freed once a domestication of a public district was established. This women's opinion was expressed in the map as part of their social interaction utilizing the urban landscape such as park or visiting friends. Their home, once central, became part of much larger Sabbath environment. Please note that most of them did not draw the synagogue, the central landmark of their roof, in their map. The one who included the temple either mentioned it at the edge of their spatial configuration of their roof or in the center with a secondary path as an addition to their major path to the synagogue used mainly by men. This mapping expresses not only women's perception of walking to this landmark, but also the differences in use of the roof between men and women of the community. These interesting findings may open a whole new line of phenomenological research and discussion. In conclusion, we have learned that the Eruv is a celebration of time when you access and are aware of the cycles of life and the grand order of nature, which provides the community a unique and distinct relationship with its temporal and physical space. In a more poetic way, we conclude quoting Rumi's poem from the 13th century, which expresses the spiritual aspect of the Eruv. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing, and right doing, there is a field. Will you meet me there? After all, what else am I doing on the Sabbath but exactly that? Beyond ideas, meeting him there in the field. Thank you.
So a clarification question for Anat.
I was asked, how do you pronounce Eruv? Okay, in Hebrew you pronounce Eruv. In English, some people are saying Eruv. So I use the Eruv as Hebrew original word. Okay, does anybody have any question? Can I turn it to the next speaker? India?
Okay, maybe you can put it on. I'll introduce you. Our next speaker is Patrick Quinn, FAIA. And here's what he had in his description bio. Wanted to be a painter, backed into architecture in Ireland. Trying to unlearn everything, he landed in Kahn's graduate class at Penn. This led to teaching to UC Berkeley in the turbulent 60s, where his work on architecture of ritual led to join programs with the Graduate Theological Union. 9 years as dean at Rensselaer led to more unlearning at the American Academy in Rome. Professional ventures in York, Paris, Ahmedabad, Dhaka, Mount Athos, and Marrakesh were interspersed with build works in 5 countries, publication exhibitions in 10, and lectured in some 50 universities. For sanity, he swims and acts. He hopes next to complete a volume on the end of church architecture. Patrick?
Thank you. I've been at 3 of these conferences. And this is the first time I presented. I finally felt an obligation. One of the reasons I took so long is that there is a curious climate. It's a strange combination. It's a combination of erudition and humility. And I didn't know where I fit in. I was reminded, looking at the roster of people for this one, of some years ago when I see the erudition and the scholarship around me. I was reminded of a dear friend, James Feely, landscape architect, city planner, who had studied under McHarg at Yale while I studied under Lou Kahn. And when he went back to Ireland, I wrote to him about a series of works by great architects all over America and elsewhere. And Jim wrote back to me and said, they're all great men. They happen to be old men at this time. They are all great men. And here am I, he said, trying to put 2x4s together. Well, that's what I feel here. I begin with a little quote. D.H. Lawrence, in his 1928 introduction to the short stories of Verga, it was called Cavalleria Rusticana, he wrote, "A great deal of the meaning of life and of art lies in the apparently dull spaces, the pauses, the unimportant passages." In this essay, I'll discuss two built works that deal with the issue of transition between the sacred and the secular. It's a little bit of history, really, but history in somewhere an in-between realm. The two projects are the Millennial Project at London's Southwark Cathedral. That's an urban solution. And a parish complex of St. Jude Church in Boca Raton, Florida, which offers a suburban approach. I just discovered the Southwark Project this time last year, just about this time last year, when I was wandering around London and stumbled on it. And I said, I must do some more about this. I use the title is Transcending Boundaries, Geometry in the Service of the Sacred. That's easy to misunderstand. I use the word geometry in its basic Euclidean sense of giving measurable order to the places we inhabit. It's far removed from the sophistication of, say, Corb's modular, or Peter Eisenman's design for the Church of the year 2000, which has this wonderful series of liquid crystals, as he calls them, with the congregation in one set on one side of the road of a passage and the sanctuary on the other side, supposed to be communicating. A very strange Peter Eisenman approach. I'm not going there. I use the term sacred from the viewpoint that a place is made sacred primarily by what happens within, by what goes on there, rather than by consecration or symbolic form. Sacred event evokes sacred place and gives rise to sacred space, sacred form. Sacred places like Notre Dame de Paris or St. Patrick's in New York, they are indeed places apart. There are temenoses or temenoi, but they open too abruptly off the street, offering no degrees of inwardness, as I call it, merely a quick hop, a quick jump from the profane to the sacred. And there's a need for something in between. I'm still mindful, after 50 years, of the impact of Lucan's notion of spaces that serve and spaces that are served. One can think of transitions as servant spaces, but less static than in, for example, Lucan's Trenton bathhouse. I felt humbled by Nader's quotation of my favorite Lucan statement. At about the same time as Kahn was conceiving this notion, Aldo van Eyck posited the importance of the in-between realm in architecture. His Wheels of Heaven design for a Roman Catholic church reflected both his architectural conviction and his notion that there, the Roman Catholic liturgical story needs to be loosened up. He said, on the other hand, the Protestants have no story, they need to be sharpened up. So we had a great argument over that. J.B. Jackson's journal Landscape in 1962 published the pioneering manifesto toward making places. It stressed, among other ideas, the role of boundaries as places of transition rather than separation. Harvey Cox, in The Feast of Fools, which is somewhere between the secular city and the future of faith, says Christianity does not share a sense of comedy with other traditions, or does share a sense of comedy with other traditions, but its grounds are different. Instead of one world of shadow and deception, it affirms two real-world ages, the passing one and the coming one, neither of which should be seen without reference to the other or taken with full seriousness on its own. We live in between. My two subject projects are set in places whose reality smacks of the comic. Southwark, in the time of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, was the bawdiest area in London. Even today, we find the ludicrous juxtaposition of the once dominant cathedral, with such things as pianos, Ranzo pianos, towering shard of glass, and other newcomers such as the Disney-like replica of Admiral Drake's Golden Hind. They are all appearing there. Boca Raton, equally comic, is a suburb trying to be a city, home to high-tech corporate headquarters, golf courses, Hispanic culture, and snowbirds wintering in the mouth of the Rat. This 13th, by the way, the architect for the project at Southwark is Richard Griffiths. You haven't heard of him? Richard Griffiths, a great architect. The 13th century London Church of St. Mary Overy, which means over the river, was sited on low, marshy ground next to the River Thames. During Shakespeare's time at the Globe Theatre, the area had bear baiting, dog fighting, brothels, and dubious taverns. In 1538, it was renamed St. Saviour's. And by the late 19th century, it had fallen into great disrepair, and the nave had reached this area here. You see it bending even in the 15th century when this was done. The nave had reached a state of imminent collapse by the 19th century. So they called in the renowned Arthur Blomfield. He was asked to restore the church and extend the nave. Not only did he repair and restore the building between 1890 and 1897, but he amplified its Gothic grandeur, and it became a cathedral in 1905. This is an important time because I left out what I was going to say, and it doesn't matter. By the 20th century, the cathedral was surrounded by a densely packed cityscape of warehouses served by narrow alleyways, as wretched as Dickens knew it when he wrote The Old Curiosity Shop. Overy was probably the Londoners' equivalent of the American term, the wrong side of the tracks. By mid-century, it was hemmed in by commercial, marine, industrial, and railway structures. The river was blocked from view. Now, this photograph, back. This photograph is at a time, too bad, I just blew it, I think. Oh no, I'm all right, I'm okay, thank you. The river was blocked from view, but not in this photograph, which is fairly recent. It's taken from the Shard up above. How ironic that the cathedral, in this awful setting, should have a chapel named for John Harvard, founder of the great university, who was baptized right there. That's the chapel. By the late 20th century, the growth of South Bank cultural facilities west from the Royal Festival Hall included important works like Norman Foster's, we messed this up, don't we? Like Norman Foster's City Hall. The Tate Modern is back up here. Down here, there's a new bridge by Calatrava, and so on. The Tate Modern was formerly a power station. There's also Sam Wanamaker's restoration of the Globe Theatre further down. And across the street from the cathedral, the London Bridge tube station. Other structures added to this incursion. In 1984, Ronald Sims, the architect, added a new chapter house, this hexagonal series here, to the cathedral, chapter house and refectory and offices, with a connection through one of the doors, two of the doors of the cathedral. It presented, however, a challenge to the next architect. As the millennium approached, a visionary dean, Colin Slee, commissioned the architect of the fabric, Richard Griffiths, to plan and design expanded facilities beyond the liturgical and parochial to reach out to a projected increase of casual visitors. Richard's extension here shows the existing Ron Sims building. Back again, please. The existing Ron Sims building, but all of this has changed. And what Richard has done has created a square and a street. A glass-roofed indoor street, which marks the site of an historic laneway. They have taken over what they call Montague Chambers, lawyers' chambers, old, and they've turned this into the office. A linked building of meeting rooms and chapter room are here. Library and refectory are here. This is the north side of the cathedral. Thus it opens, it separates and connects the cathedral from the new buildings. The lane opens to the neighborhood at both ways, and the major axis here through the square, which is planted on this side, built on that side, opens to yet another space and another space leading to the river. This gives an idea of, if you can see it, just here are the hexagonal monosims, and here are the link buildings, the new buildings, and the cathedral itself. The transitional structures under Griffith's handling have a strong and serene character. The immediate elements are proportional to human movement. Scale, light, and geometry form a series of graceful transitions all the way from the quiet cathedral interior and its monumental exterior to the vibrant life of London and the Thames bankside. The cafe, built on the site of a medieval refectory, gives onto this Millennium Courtyard, as it's called, where one has outdoor dining. This in turn opens through a pillared gateway to Montague Close, leading to the chambers, and to a new space across the river, which is marked by a grid of plane trees. And so the cathedral is connected by stages through the street, through the court, through the close, to another court, to the river, and to all the traffic. The indoor street poses a 19th century wall to a 20th century wall. The latter articulated with vertical rectangular openings in rhythmic proportions of 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 1 to 4, 4 to 8, and so on. Very simple geometry. The wall at the east end, on the other hand, is a more somber geometry. This is a 21st century wall facing a 13th century wall, and has a more somber geometry with paired buttresses. I'll learn to use this thing soon. Paired buttresses and horizontal rectilinear windows above, giving a whole different approach to the centers of administration and scholarship. A subtle modular order of the buttresses mark a gentle, measured procession, a gently paced procession. Each end of the street, as I said, opened up to the neighborhood, and Montague Close, for instance, has the Mudlark, a pub. You have to have a pub, a traditional pub, near any space in England. Historic references abound. Doesn't it work? Yes, it does. 16th century kiln and pottery has been excavated and left permanently exposed as a kind of link with the origin of this street. In the refectory, the cafe, which opens onto the courtyard, there's a decided Roman reference to the original settlements. Here, the arch, the deep terracotta arch, is really reminiscent and evocative of Ostia Antica and some of the villas there from the 4th century. Outside in the courtyard, the buttresses, alternatively paired and single, add visual strength to the exterior walls, but very simply. The facade openings alternate between rectangles of modest size and larger arched windows that are counterpoint to the rhythm of the upper windows of the cathedral. It's all in service of scaling the geometry of the cathedral down to the domestic level and human scale of the transitional space. The entire precinct, including the re-landscaped, quiet southern garden, is a place of peace and refuge. The library and refectory wing, it has this peculiar protrusion which lightens up and gives a sense of humor to the more sober geometry of the facade. This provides shelter. The series of buildings, low to tall, all the way around, provides shelter from the winds from diners or those who wish to study in the nooks between the hedges here.
5 minutes.
Wow, I better go fast. Sorry. I was going to ask you to warn me when it was 10, but oh dear. Well, the next project is a church and school built in 1983, 79 to 83. The architect, by the way, was yours truly. Apologies for that. No apologies for that. It includes a school, meeting places, a church, and a contemplative chapel. The tower there is not a bell tower or anything else. It's simply a ventilation. The sustainability of this building I could go into, but that's not our subject now. The double roofs and so on. It makes a great difference. There. Whereas the Southwark Millennium Project involved in opening an historic sacred place to the life of the city, the Boca Raton project does the seemingly impossible, the opposite, offering successive degrees of inward access to a brand new one. The realization here is, again, a street and a square with fountains, smaller square, an indoor street beyond a baptistry which is on an axis with this node here, an exterior octagonal fountain with an octagonal baptistry, little chapel beyond, and a street wandering around and finally leading to the center. The geometry of this is simply a 12-inch module, in which this is 48 by 48, 24 by 48, and this is 12 feet all around, as this is 12 by 12, and so on. I discovered that the geometry of Griffith's project in Southwark, and he just wrote this to me yesterday, is 3.6 meters, which is just about exactly 12. I'll take you very briefly through, so without further discussion. The outdoor street, which ends at the node of the fountain. Oh, one other thing I should explain is one can touch everything, the eaves, the roof, everything is tangible until one gets inside. Even the baptistry is tangible. One turns from the chapel into the indoor street, which echoes the outdoor street, with 9 stained glass windows. The theme is the tree of life, with outdoor vegetation interfering with the tree. And we come to the apse, turn left into a much higher space, which is surmounted around the altar by a great corona of light. There's a corona, a recessed opening, which is open to rear screen projection for video and so on, and film, a circle of vision. And up here we have a circle of sound projecting. And above it, we have the ventilation, a circle of ventilation, if you wish, or of air. Can't get back here. And I conclude by saying the modern reredos, remember everything was tangible, human scale until we come into this point. The modern reredos is an abstract geometric ordering of planes and circles. I mentioned the 4 circles. Occasionally there's a circle cast from the east window, which makes a 4th circle on the floor here during Mass. The geometric abstraction of these utilitarian elements generates an interior monumentality that transcends the physical tangibility of the outer structures. It's the opposite of Richard's. Geometry, scale, and materials evolve towards more abstract forms that, coupled with the loftier space, emphasize the mystical nature of Eucharistic liturgy. To sum up, the 2 examples, one urban English, one suburban American, illustrate that geometry, scale, and material detail, carefully and modestly disciplined, can serve to modulate the transitions between the most sacred inner realms and the busting reality of the world outside. But there are some questions arise. The concept is not necessarily applicable to churches or to religious spaces. The question is, A, whether it's applicable, the idea of this modulated shift in scale, size, and so on through simple geometry is applicable to all religious spaces, to all urban spaces where human involvement is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Let me introduce the last speaker for this afternoon. Philip Bess is a professor of architecture and teaches graduate urban design and theory at the University of Notre Dame. He has led professional and academic design workshops for city neighborhoods and small towns throughout the United States, and his current work focuses upon metropolitan Chicago. From 1987 and 1988, he directed the Urban Baseball Park Design Project of the Society for American Baseball Research. And in Boston, in August 2000, he directed the ultimately successful Save Fenway Park Community Design Workshop. He's the author of numerous articles and 3 books, including City Baseball, Magic, and Till We Have Built Jerusalem. Philip will present a paper entitled After Burnham, Our Latest Plans of Chicago 2109.
Thank you. What, how do I bring this up?
Oh, maybe do it.
Yeah. Sorry. Do you want to start the timer? That would probably be good, wouldn't it? Oh. And does this, yeah, that advances. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invitation to be here. The work that I'm going to show today is just part of a 2-year project funded by a grant from the Historical Society as one of 20 research projects addressing the programmatic theme of religion and innovation in human affairs. After Burnham deals broadly with certain effects of religion upon urban form and makes conjectures about the possible future influence of religion upon the challenge of contemporary urban congestion, viewing and addressing these topics through the lens of Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago. The effects of religion upon urban form are here considered under 2 aspects. First, the multiple religious communities who make place in modern societies, including here the Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studio as an example of such a community. And second, the character of the places that modern societies make now and in the future. A word about Notre Dame. We are the only degree-offering architecture school in the country, perhaps in the world, that has classical architecture and urbanism as the foundation of its curriculum. And After Burnham represents the work of 2 Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studios in the fall of 2011 and the fall of 2012, as well as the work of selected alums of our Graduate Urban Design Studio. It's tempting to characterize our approach at Notre Dame as countercultural, but I'm going to refrain from such a characterization and say instead that our aspiration is that Notre Dame's approach to architecture and urbanism be Catholic in both a large C and a small c sense. This aspiration is reflected in our consideration and embrace of both Catholic metaphysical realism and Catholic social teaching. In addition, we seek to learn and participate in an intellectual tradition with roots in both classical antiquity and biblical religion that views human well-being as the very purpose of cities and the apotheosis of creation itself as the city of God. At Notre Dame, we seek to learn and extend these understandings of the purpose of cities, and we operate with the assumption that urbanism is a complex thing, always and everywhere simultaneously an environmental order, a demographic order, an economic order, a moral order, and a formal order, all of which we as Catholic Christian teachers understand to exist within and sometimes to reveal an overarching context of sacred order. I was hoping to hear a laugh at this. Explicitly or not, these assumptions about architecture and cities and sacred order and human flourishing were shared by most human beings prior to the modern era. But among its revolutions, modernity also revolutionized architecture and cities. The success of modernity can be measured by dramatic increases in human mobility, lifespan, and per capita income wherever modern institutions have established themselves. But these successes come at a price. Powerful accounts abound of the suffering that modernity engenders as traditional societies become modern societies. and the modern view of nature as raw material for human purposes, which has resulted in both the potential and the reality of environmental catastrophes at unprecedented scale, has created wholly modern discontents. An additional critique views modernity as culturally unsustainable because of the individualist, therapeutic, consumerist character type that modern societies seem to mass produce. The long intellectual tradition of which Notre Dame sees itself as part views cities and character formation, and hence cities and human well-being, as intimately related. If true, this should give us pause. Ours is the time of what some call hypermodernism, a time of exploding urbanization in the modernizing societies of Asia, Africa, and South America, and time in the aftermath of almost 70 years of American suburbanization. Both modern megacities and suburban sprawl represent distinctively modern forms of human settlement, but neither is typically evaluated holistically with respect to the relationship of urban formal order to either environmentally or culturally sustainable human well-being. A primary reason for this is that questions about nature, cities, culture, and human well-being are also philosophical and religious questions that pertain to public and common goods. Such questions, let alone proposed answers to them, get little, if any, traction today because for many persons in the modern world, philosophical and religious questions are essentially private. Hypermodernist urbanism therefore proceeds apace, both its metaphysical assumptions and its own intrinsic nature remaining largely uncritiqued. On July 4th, 1909, at a moment when Chicago was both the fastest growing and most quintessentially modern city in the world, and the Chicago Cubs were reigning world champions, the last time that they were reigning world champions, the Commercial Club of Chicago published Daniel Burnham's Plan of Chicago. Justly praised to this day for its regional sensibilities and environmental prescience, it is often criticized for its allegedly autocratic social and design sensibilities. Less commonly noted, even by admirers, is that the Plan of Chicago was one of the last great efforts to employ classical principles of architectural, landscape, and urban design in and for and at the scale of a rapidly expanding modern industrial metropolitan region. This it did consciously participating in Western culture's long tradition, a metaphysical realist and sacramental tradition of humanist urbanism. In its centennial year of 2009, even Chicago commentators typically treated the Plan of Chicago as a historical document, the relevance of which had largely passed. In particular, there was a sense, rarely spoken but widely assumed, that in a world of hypermodern megacities, the relevance of humanist urbanism itself has passed. This assumption represents a challenge to the Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studio, and After Burnham is our response to that challenge. Taking the 1909 Plan of Chicago as an authoritative starting point, After Burnham seeks to demonstrate that classical humanist architecture and urbanism and Catholic social teaching together, better than modernism or hypermodernism, can locate the modern metropolis in both nature and sacred order in a manner practical, humane, symbolically legible, and beautiful for the sake of human flourishing in both time and eternity. In her classically informed approach to architecture and urbanism, Notre Dame at her best seeks all of the traditional Vitruvian virtues of durability, comfort, beauty, and decorum. But the extent to which Notre Dame's approach also addresses contemporary concerns for sustainability is often overlooked by our critics. And here I can give but a glimpse of how Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109 addresses issues of land use, transportation, water conservation and treatment, and polycentric urbanism, all in ways consonant with an ethic of environmental stewardship. This slide shows population growth and patterns of land occupation in metropolitan Chicago from the mid-1850s, with more than a quadrupling of land occupied between 1936 and 2009 for less than double the total population. Presuming a similar population in 2109, not, we think, steady, but following a pattern of depopulation and repopulation, Our Lady's plan places virtually the same population on less than 30% of the land area of 2009 metropolitan Chicago. This slide shows Metro Chicago's 2109 population located primarily around existing and improved city and regional rail service, and how post-1945 sprawl has reverted back to farmland, prairie, and forest. This slide illustrates the increasingly frequent flooding problems in Metro Chicago caused by the combination of Chicago's impervious surfaces and reverse-engineered river system. And Our Lady's plan's multi-front effort to recapture stormwater and sewage and return it as fresh water either to the ground or by a re-reversal of the Chicago River to Lake Michigan. This slide illustrates our proposed settlement types throughout metropolitan Chicago, ranging from rural hamlets and villages at local state and county crossroads at a density of 5,000 to 8,000 people per square mile, to urban neighborhoods in excess of 25,000 people per square mile. Incidentally, we believe that sprawl suburbs are certain to contract less from energy shortages than from current declining birth rates and the economic unsustainability of local sprawl infrastructure. This slide illustrates in green the interstate highway right-of-ways within the city limits of Chicago and suggests how some of them may be re-urbanized and greened. Now, whatever disagreements may exist about the details of these several proposals and their implications for environmental sustainability, we suspect there will be fairly wide agreement about the objective of environmental sustainability, not least because Notre Dame's long-term view of the future is hopeful, and our short-term view of the future is merely pessimistic rather than apocalyptic. But there is another immediate issue about which there will not be broad agreement, and that has to do with the symbolic content of traditional architecture and traditional formal representations of the sacred. And it's to this subject that I want to devote the rest of my talk. Bess's first and second laws of architecture and urbanism state, first, architecture always symbolizes power and aspires to symbolize legitimate authority. Example, another example in the tradition of classical humanism. On the left, architecture as power aspiring to authority, a modernist version of that, and a hypermodern on the left, and a hypermodernist version of that on the right. The second law of Bess's laws of architecture and urbanism state, a widespread desire for and expectation of social predictability from everyone else, the culture of bureaucracy, combined with a widespread desire for and expectation of maximum freedom for oneself, the culture of personal autonomy, will never produce a beautiful, coherent, and intelligible public realm. So, a couple of examples. Recognizing that all spirituality has a personal component, allow me to observe that an interest in personal spirituality today appears to increase in direct proportion to the disappearance of the sacred from the public realm and the decline of religious authority. Authority in the public realm today belongs not to the sacred, not even to the civic, but rather to corporate capital, to the bureaucratic state, and to the artist self-defined. Some will no doubt say that our religious and civic leaders have squandered their historic authority, that this explains the absence of great civic and religious buildings in the modern world, and that on the whole, this is a just and deserved situation. And yet, if the civic and the sacred cede the public realm to the corporation, the bureaucracy, and the artist, how will any of the latter ever be held to account? What becomes of justice when justice is simply that which is defined by those who hold power? In sacred order, the corrupt cleric is held to account, here or in eternity. In desacralized modernity, who holds the corrupt businessman or politician to account? I want to suggest that this concern for legitimate authority, the very idea of which implies sacred order, is implicit in the Plan of Chicago, and it is quite explicit in Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109. I hope it will be clear in what follows that this is not a special pleading for Catholicism or Christianity or religion generally. It's more aptly regarded as expressing the principle of subsidiarity, in which neither church nor state nor commerce dominate the public realm, but rather where each finds their rightful place suited to their proper realms of authority. Let me try to illustrate this quickly. Okay, so here's Chicago, the Central Business District, right around 1900. Go back. And this is the site where Daniel Burnham proposed to locate his city hall at Halsted and Congress, or what would become Congress, which is not shown here. So that's 1900. This is, the circle represents the Central Business District in Burnham's Plan of Chicago from 1909. And here was his strategy for reorienting the symbolic organization of Chicago. He placed he proposed another business district to the south side of Congress Street. This map, incidentally, is east-west up. So he proposed an extension of the business district to the south of Congress Street, and then proposed a city hall at the intersection of Halsted and Congress, thereby creating a civic axis and a kind of counterweight to the commercial center of Chicago, in which Congress Street becomes the new center of the city of Chicago. And this is what that looked like in the famous aerial rendering of Jules Guerin, and this is another famous Guerin rendering of Burnham's proposed city hall and plaza at Congress and Halsted. So what actually happened in post-1945 metropolitan Chicago? What happened was freeways and sprawl. So this is a plan, this is Burnham's plan in 1909, this is the existing condition in 1966, and what happened where Burnham proposed a city hall at the intersection of Congress and Halsted, what actually happened was at Congress and Halsted was located the Chicago Circle interchange. And we get this great quote from a well-known history of Chicago. It's obvious to the student of Chicago today that a great deal of the plan has not commended itself to public attention, but many elements have become commonplace elements of the city. Among those features which have been implemented are the placing of the Chicago Circle, major focus of the city's expressway system, at a location originally designed by the plan as the Civic Center Plaza. So this is Chicago 2009, where I would characterize the symbolic content as the order of modern capital, except in Chicago it's the order of modern crony capital. And so that's what it looks like. So this is the Plan of Chicago compared to Our Lady's Plan of Chicago of 1909 compared to Our Lady's Plan of Chicago in 2109 for the central area, where we propose to locate City Hall at the same place, and where and in the same location at the intersection of Congress and Halsted, where the supposition is that we've reclaimed the interstate right-of-way and restored that fabric and created this site for the City Hall. So where Burnham had a civic axis, we're proposing restoring the civic axis and creating a sacred axis. So I want to talk about, real quickly, sacred order and urban form in America, and how we've formalized non-established and free exercise those ideas in American life. So these are examples of different ways we've done that. This is Jackson Square of New Orleans with the Cathedral of St. Louis. It's a centralized square. Its relationship to the church is formal. It's singular. It's one church. This is New Haven, Connecticut, where again you have a centralized square and a formal relationship, but here not between one church but three churches. So it's centralized, formal, and plural. This is a centralized and informal plural relationship in Evanston, Illinois, where you have a centralized square and 5 churches that are arranged around it in a kind of ad hoc way. In Savannah, Georgia, you have, in some ways, to my way of thinking, the best diagram of church-state relations in the U.S., where you've got centralized squares, except a polycentric condition, which is formal and plural in the relationship of the churches to the squares. There are 11, I think 11 of the 23 squares have religious buildings that front them. And then you have the linear circumstance, both the scale of the small town and at a bigger scale as well. This is Port Gibson, Mississippi. It's Highway 61, where as you come into town from Highway 61, within a stretch of a half a mile, you have 8 churches located along Highway 61. And then here's that phenomenon at a larger scale. We all know Washington, D.C., and its major axis to the Potomac and the cross-axis and the sites that were that existed nascently in the L'Enfant plan, and then were added to and extended by the Macmillan plan of 1901 that Daniel Burnham was also involved in. But those axes also, one of those axes extends to the north along 16th Street, where you get this condition. You get approximately, in 4 miles, you get approximately 30 religious buildings that are located on 16th Street, which is on this axis, right? And there's the White House, and here's 16th Street. You can't see all those churches, but you can see the dots there. And so you get 29 churches or 30 churches on 16th Street. So another example of a linear, informal, plural manifestation of religious buildings in public life. And even in Chicago in 1857, before it became overwhelmed by commerce, was organized this way, where you had the site of City Hall, and it was flanked by 2 churches in a formal relationship, and then eventually there was a development of churches along what is today Wabash Avenue, but then was known informally as Church Street. But as I say, all of that got overwhelmed by commerce in the second half of the 19th century. And here's that relationship with public square, church, church, public square, church, church, and then various churches off in this direction that are shown here. This is from Daniel Bluestone's book. I'm blanking on the title. So civic order and sacred order in Chicago. This is Our Lady's Plan of Chicago take on this and what inspired it. So whereas Burnham proposed a civic axis, we're proposing to reestablish the civic axis and establish a sacred axis. And what is that sacred axis? Well, it's located in that zone right there, the green zone right there. And the question was, what's the content, what's the scale, what's the character? Well, the content is the multiplicity of religious communities that exist within Chicago. So we're imagining, what's illustrated here are a mosque and a Hindu temple and a Buddhist temple and the Mormon temple and a Greek Orthodox church and a Protestant church and a Catholic church and a synagogue. So we imagine that these would occupy that sacred axis. Here were a series of studies that we did that looked at the sacred axis and whether it was something that would be continuous or something that would be discontinuous. There were disagreements in the design team. I ultimately opted for the continuous axis, and we can talk about that afterwards if you're interested. This is a comparison, a scalar comparison between the sacred axis right here. The distance from here to there is 1.2 miles. This is Randolph Street. This is Roosevelt Road for those of you that know Chicago. And so it's comparable to Savannah along Bull Street, the extension of Bull Street through the squares and then down through Forsyth Park. This is Commonwealth Avenue, the mile-long stretch of Commonwealth Avenue right here. This is Washington, D.C., from the Capitol building to the Washington Monument. And this is Paris from the Louvre to the Arc de Triomphe, all at the same scale. So this is an enlargement of that area shown there. This is a comparison of our space to the Washington Mall, Grant Park, to Central Park in New York, and again to Paris and the Champs-Élysées. This is the east elevation of our proposed Chicago City Hall with a church and a synagogue located, but this is just a short little version of the 1.2 miles. This is a perspective of the City Hall on the civic axis. Here's a perspective looking north on the sacred axis. This is an aerial perspective of the sacred axis at the south end, the detail of that. This is an aerial perspective detail of the crossing between the sacred and the civic axis. This is an aerial perspective of the entire sacred axis. We have to stop? Yeah. I'll stop.
Thank you. Maybe when is the time? Maybe before I have any questions, I open it to you to ask any comments or any questions to the presenters. The first 3 very different take on the relation between sacred space, culture, and spirituality in the city. So, any comment or question? Dennis.
Comments on Chicago.
Wait. Got to take.
Comments on Chicago and Washington. I remember years ago, I doused for energy lays going through the White House up 16th Avenue, and the major energy leak going up that road. There, most energy lays when Abe Lincoln was president, and nothing when Richard Nixon, they all dissolved
What was it that dissolved? Oh,
because of the occupants.
no. Okay.
The other thing about having that big circle of interchange at that sacred place, I mean, if you consider sacred space being for the people, you can say that that interchange does that, right? It just happens to be for, you know, uses that we wouldn't necessarily like, but it really did that as a circle. That's it.
Okay, any response?
Well, let's see. When I sent this, I sent this image to a friend of mine who made the comment that for Burnham, the original diagram. I mean, I look at it and I see the city hall, and I see the public square, and I see a spatial realm that's made for a civic realm. And his comment was that that Burnham himself, the way that he showed all the radiating avenues coming in and out of it, was suggesting that it was some kind of interchange for traffic, and that he was micromanaging all of the traffic. And I mean, I hate to think that that in fact was what Daniel Burnham was doing, and I'm pretty certain actually that that it wasn't. So
Ask her. She's giving a lecture.
yeah, no, I believe it. And so I think that Burnham's intentions were civic, and I do think that there's a big difference between the idea of people gathered in a public piazza as a community and people who are traveling around in automobiles, not having any contact with each other.
Ram, a question here.
I have a question on Chicago and the idea of the sacred axis where you have buildings of various religious communities. And I come from India, and in India where tensions between religious communities has taken a very ugly turn right from the moment of Indian independence. The word secular has been much debated. And one common interpretation of it has been giving equal space to all religions. But there's been another critique of that, saying that that's actually wrong. What secular really means is that religious life belongs to the private realm and not the public realm.
Right.
And in cities where that has happened, that happened in feudal times, where feudal authority depended on divine sanction for its position, and that's why the religious structure was a strong part of the urban order.
So is there a question?
So I'm just wondering, should we be creating these kind of sacred axes in our city?
Well, I think that the alternative to not giving appropriate expression to sacred order in the public realm is to cede authority in the public realm to either the state or to commerce, and I think that that's problematic. I think that the state does have its own area of legitimate authority, that commerce certainly has its own area of legitimate authority, but I think that the sacred has its own realm of legitimate authority, and that in fact, and again, there's disagreement about constitutional interpretation, but my understanding is that the purpose of the Free Exercise Clause and the Non-Establishment Clause was to give space to all religious communities to act in the public realm, and that this is not something that the government grants to religious communities. It's something that the government recognizes, and that the government doesn't adjudicate between religious disputes, because in the most literal sense, government is not competent to do so. And so, and this is a huge debate, in the culture, and will be for the foreseeable future. But I think that the alternative to not giving recognition in the public realm to the sacred is to create a power situation in which there's no accountability. That's my concern, anyway. So maybe.
I enjoyed all three talks. Thank you for all three of you. My comment is for you, Patrick. Over the years, it's a comment, it's not a question, so just let it wash over you. I've very much enjoyed your pontifications at our sessions. And when you presented your building today, it struck me that your own words were very apt, that it was a perfect balance of humility and erudition. I was quite taken by it. It's a beautiful work of art. And I regret that it's taken you this long to share your work with us and to present. That's all I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry. I don't think, is it Peter? Is your name?
Philip.
Philip, I'm sorry. And you were talking quickly, so I might have misunderstood what you said. But I thought that you made some comment that spirituality was on the rise as religious leaders are experiencing some questioning from community. And so I was wondering how you were reconciling that with the focus on religious institutions as the grounding points of a sacred or spiritual.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, you know, we live in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty about the role of religious institutions in public life, and part of that comes from religious institutions in various ways squandering their authority. And I mean, the you know, Catholic bishops in the United States, and the sex abuse scandal is the premier example of that in the United States. Nevertheless, I'm actually pretty confident that human nature being what it is, that eventually we will find a need to you know, find ourselves in communities with recognized authority, and that I guess I think that you know, I mean, religion has endured for a long, long time. And I can't remember who it was. I read something just the other day, but they were writing about the state of religion in the modern world. And he concluded his essay by saying that, I think it was Rusty Reno in First Things, he concluded the essay by saying that if he were to bet on the New York Times or the Catholic Church, Harvard University, or the Mennonites in Goshen, or Yale University and the yeshivas in New York, he knows who he would bet on.
I have a question for Anat. I was fascinated by the Eru, this possibility of creating a space, place based on time, and the fact of committing a whole community to a holiday and finding ways in which that community could still commune despite the fact of the commandment of being at home. There's the idea of home, the sacred, the city. And then it came up to me as a once a week, almost idea of also related to the idea of festival, which is a whole tradition. And I was just trying to put all that together, you know, in beyond the Jewish tradition. You know, what could it mean today? How would you see that? How would you expand? And the fact that these edges are so, I wonder, you know, how they're so permeable, they're so invisible. So in theory, that the holy extends throughout. So I wonder if those boundaries should not be more defined, or should not be more, go back to kind of what maybe Philip is saying, perhaps to formalize them. Again, I'm kind of more a Western idea of definition. Perhaps they shouldn't be more defined because it's about time. And so the idea of a time and space. And would you like to comment on any of this?
The Talmud, the Jewish law, as I said, has a book about 105 two-sided pages about all the laws of what to do and not what to do at the Eruv. And one of the things is the evolution from really a very strict boundary to a very kind of metaphorically and spiritual boundary. And there is a whole historical kind of evolution through that, and a lot of discussion, debates about this kind of what is this boundary meaning, and how do we cross or not cross the boundary. And we have to read the whole 105 pages before I'm answering you the question. Yeah, but in my full paper, I have a summary of the history of the Eruv, so it gives you a little bit of idea about how it evolved. But what is interesting that it evolved into a metaphorical thing, and it's not bounded necessarily by this physical attributes. Even though there are edges and there are nodes and there are paths and there are these strings that are hanging, or there is a river or there is a mountain that confine the district, still the idea that a whole community can actually have the perception of a metaphorically spiritual realm. I think it's fascinating. And I am not a practicing Jew. I am Jewish, but I'm not practicing, so I'm not part of this orthodox set of beliefs. And so I went to Houston to look how is an eruv working. And for my shame, I was driving there, which I'm not supposed to drive in this kind of thing. And then I realized, wow, what am I doing? I'm driving there. And so I stopped and I asked people that were walking there, can I drive here? And they said, yes. If you are not part of the eruv, yes. So I was not part of the eruv. They were. So, interesting.
I'd just like to make a comment on it. It intrigues me that and right through your paper, this question came up in my mind. It's wonderful to have an implied limit that is so private and yet so public. It's known to the community that is there. I thought you had some little red symbols on some of the wires, which are a little bit too obvious, really, but I love the invisible, implied boundary and the fact that public can go back and forth and they don't know that maybe there's a, I don't know, there's a pornographic bookstore here or a gambling joint there, all within the eruv, but they don't know they're in the eruv. And it's such a beautiful distinction. But I want to ask you a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Alan Balfour recently produced a book on the Temple of Solomon, the history of the Temple of Solomon. It's just out about 3 months ago. Nowhere in it, this is a pretty detailed history with lots of images, nowhere did I find any reference to the eruv. Did it exist in the time of...
Yes.
So was it outside the temple boundary, or was the temple boundary the eruv? Because it was huge.
First of all, the eruv was established around the era of Solomon Temple.
Okay.
That's 3,000 years ago, approximately. And there are still debates if the temple, because it was a complex, it was not one building. It was a complex, if that temple was actually at the eruv district, or if the temple was a center of a larger eruv district around it. And so I cannot answer you because there is still a scholarly debate about it.
I'm going to be looking around every city I come to for the eruv.
Yes, and by the way, Nader is living in one of the eruvs. Maybe he doesn't know, or no, I don't know, but he lives there.
That leads me to a question.
Sure.
Actually, I also felt it was wonderful presentations. My question is, while this is a sort of a semi-legalistic zoning related to a particular faith, my question is, to what extent and how easily does it overlay with other zones of other people's territoriality sense to you? And then I'd like to follow up with a question to Phil.
Okay. So for your first question, in Washington, D.C., for example, the eruv, one...
Is this on?
I don't know. What is this? This is for the... Oh, so we don't have... No, this is for the video.
Oh, I see.
You can use both.
Okay. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. In Washington, D.C., there are several eruvs that are coming together, and there are boundaries that are some overlapping and some not. And it includes the Capitol. So here you go. We have a symbol of the whole nation of the United States, and it's part of an eruv. And it's one of the landmark in the eruv. So it depends where is the Jewish household that we want to cover and how we cover it, that it can extend to secular building, important monuments, or other faith as well, and include some churches and some mosques as well. So the second question?
No, second, Phil.
Okay.
With your permission.
Yes, sure.
Philip, really, your class has done an incredible work, and I want to congratulate just the effort and the focus. Whether one feels comfortable with the results is really, I believe, secondary to the challenge that you pose to yourself and your students to deal with this topic. And I wonder, so you gave some of the responses that it has received. My question to you is, now that you've done this, now that you've received some responses, and you'll receive obviously responses here, private and publicly expressed, what's your next step with what you learned?
Well, the project is about 60% through. It's a 2-year project, 2.5-year project, really. And the design work is about 98% complete. So we're still crossing some T's and dotting some I's. It's going to be written up. We've started taking it out in prime time. We haven't talked about it anywhere in Chicago yet. And are not afraid. We want it to be. I need to get my timing down better on presenting it. So, I'm eager to hear more response to it. I think most often the response has been that people are just kind of overwhelmed by the amount of work because there's over 100 drawings, and I really only showed a small bit of it, and so it's always a problem presenting it, just figuring out how to edit the material to present. We haven't gotten into, I would say, we have not gotten into a kind of serious intellectual debate about it. So, but again, in part, that's because of it really hasn't come out from under wraps. So. But thank you for the compliments. The students really did do a tremendous amount of work, and also John and Jennifer Griffin, my graduate research assistants who were graduates of the program, who did all the beautiful aerial perspective renderings. They're a remarkable. They're a couple that together produce like a 12-person office. So, but thank you.
I want to ask you. And I join the compliment. The design of the City Hall, was it a new design of your students, or was it something that you found in an archive or something like that?
No. Well, let's see. It was their design. I guess the premise of our approach to design is that we study the past for standards of excellence, and that we start out trying to imitate. We start out then trying to emulate, trying to do as well as the standard, and then trying to surpass it. I think that the best analogy that I can make, I think that this is actually the way human beings learn to do anything, and I think that it's unfortunate that too few of my colleagues and architects acknowledge that we design on the basis of what we see and what we know and what we synthesize. But the best kind of analogy that I can make, if you listen to the early music of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they're all playing, Chuck Berry covers, right? And it's because, they're learning their craft, and you can follow. A colleague of mine was sitting in a cafe in Holland, and they started playing the Rolling Stones songs in consecutive dates of release. And so he just sat there in the cafe for 6 hours and listened to the progress of the Rolling Stones, and it went from covers to their own music. And so that's a long answer to your question, but it was designed by the students, and we had a preliminary version in the fall of 2011 that I didn't show. And this is one that came out of the fall of 2012. But they designed all the buildings, but obviously they travel a lot, and they have a big repertoire of things that they've seen.
This led me to another question. Chicago is known for its history to be an avant-garde city, and to embrace a lot of new and exceptional designs. If we talk about the building design, not just the urban setting. And I think going back, I don't know, in the design of the City Hall or by your students, going back to the classic in a way, I don't know if Chicago will like it. So be careful when you go and present it.
I'm watching my back, thanks.
Just one question for Patrick. Is that you? Yeah.
I used to be.
Well, I was particularly moved by the softness and the compassion approach of this moving from the invitation to the holy. Slowly you go closer and closer. This is very humane and invitation to partake in the London example. And the other one is kind of the reverse, but similar. This very transition, this you're seduced into the holy, or you're led back into the secular. I think you talk about this idea of this clear-cut secular and holy. Perhaps not necessarily what we should be talking about. Perhaps is in this in-between space, going back to Tom's book, actually, on the between. Perhaps that's the most intriguing possibility. Can you talk more about this?
Yes, I can. I think it goes back a long way before Tom's book, as he
Yes,
knows.
yes.
Yes, my involvement in this idea started with, I mentioned the manifesto toward making places, which 4 of us wrote at Berkeley in the 60s, Charles Moore, Sim Vanderen, Don Linden, and myself. My part was the symbolic function. But all through it, we were concerned with what makes a place. And we went back to Ptolemy even, and to Alice Meynell, who wrote the very first book on this subject called The Spirit of Place in 1899. She was a young poet, and she described how in a village, its limits are defined rather like your eruv, by how far the village bell can be heard. And we talked about how birds sing to donate their ethnic domain, and so on. But one of the critical things was this idea of place not as fortress cut off, but as movement back and forth without losing definition. That's what I loved about your definition of the eruv. So it's a continuing rediscovery in the history of architecture. Because there are many precedences. I find them in Greece, in India, all over the place. In Ranakpur, for instance, the wonderful Jain temple there with so many degrees of inwardness. And when finally you come to the Garbhagriha, it's sacred emptiness. You know, nothing there. But suddenly you realize, well, that's the question. You know, so the geometry, it's just a cube, really, surrounded by all sorts of wonderful things, but there's nothing there. Sacred emptiness. Now there's all sorts of rituals go on in that temple too, in the Hindu temple, almost similar in pattern to the kind of liturgical ritual that goes on in the Catholic Church, the gifts and all the rest. So it's nothing new. All I was concerned with is in this time of what I call digital formalism, and you call it hyper-modernism, in this time of digital formalism where the digital technology has released us to do wonderful things, anything we like, anything we want, not necessarily whatever we ought. And I'm concerned with whatever we ought. And I said, we need to throttle back a little bit, not to dismiss the digital future, to embrace it, but also to bring to it this, you talked about how we learn. Well, we learn also by going through space. As Goethe, I think it was Goethe, no, Rilke said, we wake from sleep and take our waking slow. We learn by walking where we have to go. So the street and the square are such obvious things, but the way in which we move from one to the other, it doesn't require liquid crystals or fractals. It requires sensible use of tangible elements that we can proceed to and gradually open up, whether it's to the city or to the Eucharist or to the... oh, by the way, one last question. When you mentioned the sequence of churches on 16th Avenue.
Oh, in D.C., yeah.
Yeah, the Jewish Community Center is there and many others.
Yeah.
So it's not just churches.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that. I'm using...
Houses of worship.
Yes, houses of worship.
My question at the end to everybody is,
Yeah.
is this approach, has it disappeared, or is it this simple approach of how do we use our basic knowledge of geometry? And you don't have to be in Golden Section, you don't have to be Roll or Palladi or any of them. I don't know whether that's your question.
Last comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, I think what we saw ourselves as doing in looking at these precedents was we were looking at the kind of natural, informal arrangements that communities and municipalities and how religious communities take shape along public space, and we were simply looking to formalize it. I think we were seeing it as a kind of apotheosis of this idea of a linear, I mean, of any number of comparable size linear spaces that may not serve exactly that purpose, but also the kinds of spaces that do serve that purpose but are arranged in a more ad hoc kind of way. We were trying to put those two things together. And I mean, one of the things that there was a constant discussion in the studio was that there was a kind of misconception, I think, on the part of the students that if we did that, that somehow we were devaluing all of the local neighborhood churches and squares throughout the city, and that's not it at all. I mean, it's really, I mean, this is operating at a much bigger sort of symbolic scale, at the scale of the city, and I've referred to it elsewhere as a Baroque scale. And I think that the only reason we were particularly interested in that is because the scale of hyper-modern urbanism is really not legible. It tends to be a conglomeration of things, and so we were looking for something for traditions of city making that work at a scale like that where you can accommodate large buildings and large numbers of people.
Can I respond to that?
Okay,
Just one aspect.
yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned, you illustrated Frank Gehry's Bilbao there
Yes.
as an
Yeah,
example
right,
of
right.
hypermodernism.
Right.
But I think you sell it short. I disliked Gehry intensely some years ago. Thought the man was nuts, even though I knew what he was about. I went to Bilbao and lived there for a week studying the building, just as I lived for a week in La Torre studying that, 13th century, 21st century. And I found the most remarkable things. I found that Gehry is a very common sense, down-to-earth architect who certainly dresses his spaces in very advanced materials. But in Bilbao, the connection between the old town and the river, where used to be a series of industrial buildings keeping the river away from the town, he has made a wonderful scalar and physical transition to the river and along the river. And inside, he's made seeing space an adventure in light, but the light is very carefully controlled and very carefully established. So I just wanted to make that little bit of elaboration.
All right.
Okay, let's thank our speakers.